I am honored to be here today to tell you about my father's life of defiance and resistance during the Holocaust. Herman Wygoda was a 33-year-old civil engineer living in Warsaw the day the Germans invaded Poland. He survived by living a covert life in Poland first, and then in Germany, and later in Italy, where he was an armed resistance fighter until the end of the war. But his resistance didn't end there, because early on he realized the importance of bearing witness to future generations. So in 1945, he wrote his memoir of the Holocaust while all the events were still fresh in his mind. After the war, he came to the United States and started a new life and a new family in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Can I have the first slide, please? This is a picture of my parents, Herman and Ray Wygoda, taken on their wedding day in Chattanooga in 1947, about a year after he came to the United States. When they met, my mother was a widow with a 6-year-old daughter named Lois, who my father adopted after they got married. My other sister, Sylvia, was born in 1948, and me, I was born in 1951. Have the next slide, please. My father became a United States citizen on April 29th, 1952, when I was 5.5 months old. He was a true patriot. He loved and supported his new country. Every summer, he would pack us all up in his station wagon and drive us around the country to show us what he called this great nation. We saw the Liberty Bell, the Alamo, the Grand Canyon. We went inside the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building. We went inside the Washington Monument and inside the White House. There were these and many other trips we took as a family across the country. Next slide, please. He was a self-employed general contractor who developed several subdivisions and designed, built, and sold the homes in those subdivisions. Today, hundreds of families in Chattanooga live in houses that he built in the 1950s and 1960s. Now, in 1965, he himself translated his Polish memoir into English. Well, he died in 1982, and years later, his memoir was published posthumously. Now, as you listen to my father's story, please keep in mind that a victim does not have to take up arms in order to resist. As my niece, Deborah Klezmer, so eloquently wrote in the introduction to her grandfather's memoir, even in the cruelest hours of war, Jews all over Europe resisted. They resisted by surviving another hour, another day. Each moment they lived through was a moment of courage, of honor, of resistance. Next slide, please. Herman Wygoda was born on November 18th, 1906, in Offenbach, Germany, to Polish parents, Hanna and Meyer Wygoda. Here he is seen holding his mother's hand. The other lady, her name was Golda. She was one of Hanna's 5 sisters. Hanna also had 4 brothers. Now, 2 of her sisters had immigrated to the United States prior to the war, and they survived. One of her 4 brothers had died prior to the Holocaust, but Hanna and all her other brothers and sisters were murdered during the Holocaust. We know very little about my father's father, Meyer, other than the fact that he was killed in World War I. Now, after Meyer was killed, Hanna took Herman and his little brother Leon back to her hometown of Kossow, Poland, a very tiny town located about 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. There, he married, and the couple had a son. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, that's a picture of Leon with Hanna, taken in the 1930s. Next slide, please. There is my father's son that was born in 1934. His name was Samuel. But the couple later separated, and my father raised Samuel himself with the help of his mother. The three of them lived together in a downtown Warsaw apartment. Now, in the summer of 1939, my father knew that war was coming. And he also knew that when the Germans took over Poland, the Jews there would suffer the same terrible fate that the German Jews had been suffering since Hitler came to power in 1933. My father knew what was happening in Germany because he used to listen to international broadcasts on his shortwave radio. He was aware that of the nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses that occurred almost as soon as Hitler came to power. And then he was aware of the increasingly severe anti-Jewish discriminatory laws that the Germans enacted during the next 6 years, laws that excluded Jews from the German economy and social life. He also was aware of the destruction of thousands of Jewish businesses and the burning down of hundreds of synagogues that occurred during Kristallnacht in the fall of 1938. So he figured that it would be far safer for his son and his mother to be with his brother Leon in the little town of Kossow with Leon and his family. So he took them there, and he returned to Warsaw where he worked. Next slide, please. Well, the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. My father survived the bombardment of Warsaw and the siege that followed, and he was there on the sidewalk watching as the first German troops marched through the city in their victory parade after the city surrendered. Almost immediately, the Germans started issuing anti-Jewish laws that had taken 6 years to fully develop in Germany. They were put in place in a matter of weeks in Poland. He refused to obey them all. Instead, he went underground, so to speak, assuming the identity of a Catholic Pole, but not just an ordinary Catholic Pole. No, my father posed as a Volksdeutscher, someone who had German ancestry. See, the Germans had high regard for the Volksdeutsch who lived in other countries. They weren't German citizens, but they were close to it. He got away with it. He credits his success to his language skills. He could speak German and Polish fluently, and the German he spoke was with the accent of someone from Berlin. Now, time after time, that saved his life, but also the lives of a few other people. Next slide, please. Including some who lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. He watched those walls being constructed around what was a residential section of downtown Berlin in the fall of 1940. At a certain date, all non-Jews had to be gone from there. The Jews had to remain. But all the other Jews in Warsaw and outlying cities and towns and villages in the countryside, they all had to move in there. It became a prison for Jews. Any Jew caught outside would be shot to death. Conditions in there were horrible. This section of town had been home before the war to about 160,000 people. Now there were 500,000 people crammed in there. People were dying all the time from disease and starvation. My father became a smuggler to the ghetto. What he would do is get in there and leave with valuables like diamonds and furs, and he'd sell them to farmers in the countryside in exchange for money and food that he would smuggle back in. Now, in his memoir, he never said exactly how he got in and out of that place, only that he used what he called secret passageways that were reserved for professional smugglers only. That's how he put it, but he did write about what he saw when he was in the ghetto, the dead and the dying out on the sidewalks. He said every time he left, he wondered whether he would have the courage to go back in there again because of all this misery he was seeing, but he kept going back. He said the ghetto drew him in like a magnet. He kept up this smuggling operation for about a year and a half. Now, this whole time, his family, which consisted of his son, his mother, his brother Leon and Leon's wife and their 2 daughters, they were confined to the ghetto in that tiny town of HaShoah. But my father, being very adept at getting in and out of ghettos, he would provide for them and stay with them in the ghetto for weeks at a time in between his smuggling trips to Warsaw. But one day in HaShoah, he had a run-in with the Polish police. They arrested him, they beat him up, they threw him in jail, and after a few days, they took him 10 miles away to the much larger city of Sokola, which had a very large Jewish ghetto. They put him in that ghetto and told him to stay there. Well, of course, he wasn't going to stay there. He continued with his smuggling to the Warsaw ghetto, except now he used the Sokola ghetto as his base of operations because he couldn't afford to be seen in HaShoah. If the Polish police would have spotted him, they would have killed him, and probably his family too. Well, in the middle of July of 1942, his return to Warsaw, it was not usual. Could I have the next slide, please? When he arrived, this man, a friend of his from before the war, his name was Stanislaw Gorczyca. He was a real Catholic Pole and also a postal worker, warned him that if he was going to go in the ghetto again this time, he needed to be extremely cautious. Stanislaw told him that strange things were happening at the railroad station close to the ghetto, the Danziger railroad station, that the Germans appeared to be assembling all available freight cars there, and they were covering the air vents on those cars with barbed wire and heavy boards nailed from the outside. Nobody knew what was going on except the Germans, of course. Well, nevertheless, my father went in, but he said, this time, the situation was very different. He said there was a lot more tension in the air, and whenever a German patrol was spotted, everyone ran for cover. He asked some people, what's going on here? And they told him that lately those German patrols had been shooting into the crowds indiscriminately. Then he saw in the distance what looked like a large group of Jewish men and women being led by Germans, and everybody ran. He barely made it into an apartment building before the door was slammed shut behind him. And there in that crowded lobby, he would make his way every once in a while to the front door to look through one of the peepholes. And he said what he saw outside, next slide please, was a column of Jewish men and women, such as you see here. This picture was taken in the Warsaw Ghetto. He said there was about 18 to 20 people wide, this column of people, and they were being led in the direction of the railroad station by German soldiers with bayonets fixed to their rifles. He said it took about 40 minutes for this whole procession to pass by. Then he went back out into the street, continued along his way to the place that he took the potatoes and the other food items that he smuggled in, only to be caught up in another crowd of people running like mad. This time he witnessed the murder of a young Jewish man out on the sidewalk by a Nazi SS officer who shot him in the back of the head. That convinced him that it was just far too dangerous for him to be in there, and so he left, never to go back in. Well, instead of returning to the Sokola ghetto, he went to Stanislaw's house, and Stanislaw told his wife that my father was a distant cousin and he needed a place to stay for a while. It seemed to be working out pretty good, and my father began to wonder whether it would be possible to get his son Samuel there also. And so he talked to Stanislaw about it. Stanislaw agreed and also wanted to help him get Samuel out of HaShoah and back to Warsaw. So one night, my father, wearing Stanislaw's postal uniform as a disguise and having grown a beard also, he and Stanislaw boarded a passenger train bound for HaShoah. Next slide, please. This is a map that my father drew showing, it's a little portion of a larger map showing various cities in Poland that he visited that are linked together by railroad lines. And the line you see going up from below, that was the railroad line. They were on that train heading toward Malkinia up at the top, where they had to change trains to go to Kossaw over to the right. Now, you'll notice that he drew in the name Treblinka Death Camp. It was about halfway between Malkinia and Kossaw, about 7 miles from Kossaw, deep in the woods off that railroad spur. Well, when they got to Malkinia, they found out the trains were not running. So they decided to walk along the tracks, and they joined a group of smugglers that were walking. As they started approaching the turnoff to Treblinka, they found out why the trains weren't running. On the tracks, there were several freight trains that were stalled, waiting their turn to go into the Treblinka death camp. So they took to a road about 30 feet away and walked along. And the German and other nationalities now were guarding the train on either side of the train. They paid them no attention at all. So they walked along. My father and the others he was with, they heard people inside the freight trains. He said they heard children crying. They heard people praying. They heard others begging for water in different languages. My father said he understood all of them. So they walked along in silence. He and Stanislaw and the smugglers, they were all crying at what they were hearing. Well, they made it to Kossaw, got Samuel, took him back to Warsaw through a different route that wouldn't, end up going to Malkinia. But it didn't work out. Stanislaw's neighbors were getting suspicious about the boy. They started asking questions. And my father knew that the penalty in Poland for being caught hiding a Jew was death to the entire family, followed by burning down of the family home. And he didn't want to risk his friends' lives. So he took Samuel back toward Kossaw, but he didn't take him into the ghetto. Instead, he took him to a farm out in the countryside where he left him with a farmer friend, a Mr. Zielinski, and he made his way back to Warsaw. Now, on his way back to Warsaw, he was shot and wounded, and he almost died. While he was recovering in Warsaw, his whole family were taken to Treblinka and killed. And, his inability to having not being able to save them, it haunted him for the rest of his life. Well, at some point after that, my father found himself working at a German military camp alongside another Jewish man like he who was hiding in plain sight. Next slide, please. This is that man. His name was Leon Pettergall. And together, the two men made a really good team to help assure their mutual survival. Before the war, Leon was a professional photographer and an artist, and with his skills, he could doctor stolen ID cards beyond detection. That ID card you see there, that was carried by Leon in 1943, and that's Leon's picture stapled to it. Look how evil he looks in that picture. That was, of course, done on purpose. Who would suspect that was a Jew? He produced ID cards for my father as well. Well, they left that German camp in the spring of 1943 after a friend warned them that the Gestapo was interested in them. So they got on a passenger train bound for Warsaw. But along the way, from people in a passing train on the other track, both trains had to slow down. They yelled over to my father and others that at a rail stop in a town called Lukaw, the Germans were taking people off the trains. What was happening is the Germans were making a slave raid into Poland, taking back ordinary Polish citizens to meet a labor shortage in the war factories back in Germany. They were not importing any Jews into Germany at all. So they resorted to taking ordinary Polish citizens, and that's what was happening. So at the last stop before Lukaw, my father got out of the train, and he stood on the platform looking around, and in the middle of the train they were riding, there were two passenger cars reserved exclusively for German citizens. And with no hesitation, my father entered one of those cars, Leon right behind him. Inside there were 4 Germans, 2 civilians, 2 military men. he greeted them all with a Nazi salute. And then he and Leon sat down and made themselves comfortable. Now, my father immediately started talking to the Germans while Leon sat there holding the side of his face, pretending he had a toothache so he didn't have to talk, because he didn't know much German, and he didn't have a German accent like my father had. Well, as the train pulled into the station at Lukow, my father said he and the Germans were engaged in what he called a loud and lively conversation. Next slide, please. This is that station. It exists today. The train they were on was now stopped on those tracks. German soldiers lined both sides of the train, allowing no place to escape. As soon as the train stopped, a loudspeaker came on, issuing orders, first in German and then in Polish. In Polish, they told the passengers, regardless of your destination, everyone leave the train. Leave the doors to your compartments wide open, take all your belongings with you, report to the main waiting room in the station. Failure to obey, you'll be shot to death. But the message in German had been different. In German, the passengers were told, stay in your cars, lock your doors, don't let anyone in, we'll be leaving shortly. So as those poor Polish folks were leaving the train, my father and Leon just sat there with the Germans, and soon the train took off for Warsaw. Next, the two men went to the last place you'd expect them to go, and of course that would be Berlin. Why Berlin? No one would expect Jews to go there, so they went. There they worked for a labor company owned by two German businessmen, both of whom were members of the Nazi Party. They wore a lapel pin with a swastika. They liked my father a lot. He worked for them at various times as a foreman, as a translator, and as an armed courier, taking company money and documents to various places in Europe. Leon worked for them as a draftsman. Next slide, please. In his role as courier, he once took a trip to a mining camp in far northern Finland. And on that particular trip, he took with him a teenage Jewish boy who he and Leon had discovered among a group of newly recruited company workers. And that boy, now equipped with false documents filled out by Leon, he found himself working in a place of relative safety. Next slide, please. In his role as a translator, my father was assigned to a mining camp under construction in Estonia near the town of Jovi, but deep in the woods. After just a few days, he contacted his bosses and asked if they would send Leon also. He claimed Leon was his cousin, and he'd like to have Leon around. And these men liked my father, so they sent Leon along. At first, he and Leon thought about trying to escape to the Russian front, of all places. But they gave up on that idea when a couple other men did try, but they were caught by local hunters, returned to the camp, and then hanged to death in front of the company office as a warning to others. After about 6 weeks, my father asked for and received permission to take a leave of absence for a few days. In his memoir, he said he wanted to go back to Warsaw to see his friends and also see if he could help get anyone out of what he called that terrible place. Well, his arrival in Warsaw corresponded with the final week of that Warsaw Ghetto revolt. And the day he arrived, next slide please, was the day the Germans set fire to the ghetto to drive out the remaining resistors. It was May 12th, 1943. For 4 days, he watched what he called that desperate but unequal fight through a window in a friend's apartment, a man named Frank, who lived right across the street from the ghetto. Then, with the help of Frank and his other friend Stanislaw and the Polish underground, he got hold of 2 teenage Jewish boys with fake documents provided by the underground and took them back to Jovi with him to the mining camp. Then, next slide please, the 2 men were reassigned to the company headquarters back in Berlin, and there my father was constantly made aware of the dangerous situation they were in because Right upstairs from their company office in that downtown office building, there was a Gestapo unit, and he would pass the agents almost every day in the stairwells. He was terribly frightened, but he never showed a trace of fear. He and Leon figured they were going to be discovered sooner or later, and they knew they had to get out of Germany. Well, their ticket out of Germany, so to speak, came thanks to the Allies who were now bombing Berlin. After one particular bombardment, the company they worked for was given the contract to clear out the rubble from a bombed-out government building. And my father went in first. They gave him 100 men, but he went in first to snoop around, and he found what he was hoping to find: blank travel documents, blank ID cards, and official government stamps. Now, with the documents filled out properly by Leon, the two men could go anywhere they wanted within the sphere of German influence. Next slide, please. So in December 1943, they boarded a passenger train and arrived at the Mediterranean port city of Savona, Italy. This was the time that the Germans were occupying northern Italy. Next slide, please. This is a contemporary photo of Savona, Italy. There, they worked for a construction company and felt relatively safe. And my father did a deep study of the Italian language as soon as they got there. Even though Leon tried to talk him out of it, he wanted what he called complete freedom and planned his escape to the island of Corsica that was then occupied by the Americans. He bought a motorboat. He hired two ex-Italian Navy men to navigate. He also acquired weapons on the black market. He said he was not going to be taken alive. But in the early morning hours of February 12th, 1944, he was arrested in his hotel room by the German secret field police, which was the military equivalent of the Gestapo. 5 men, a captain, a sergeant, 3 enlisted men made the actual arrest while other soldiers stood guard outside. They took him downstairs, put him in the back of a German staff car, drove him to the military garrison in Savona, questioned him for hours, and then locked him in a cell. He escaped that night and went up into the mountains to the west of Savona. After a day or two, he learned from local farmers the reason the Germans had used such elaborate precaution in arresting him, the reason they treated him with such courtesy, the reason they hadn't taken him out in the street and shot him, and that's because they thought they had captured a famous British spy that was supposed to be around. Well, of course, they got that wrong, but he also found out that Leon, too, had been arrested later that same day. Next slide, please. Well, he spent the next several weeks living in a cave high up in the mountains, location of which is shown by this arrow. And it was there in that cave that he was approached by a group of armed men. He knew who they were. They were the partisans. They asked him to come with them, and of course he went with them. They took him several miles away to a house where he met a high-ranking officer in the Italian Liberation Army. Now, my father was very eager to join the partisans, but he was astounded that after a lengthy discussion, they asked him not just to join the partisans, but to assume command of one of their units that was active in the mountains, but had recently lost their leader. He was made to understand that they selected him because a couple of the partisans in that detachment were both vying for control of the unit, and they figured it would be best to maintain harmony in that group by bringing in a total outsider to take charge. Well, my father agreed, and thereafter he became known only as Comandante Enrico. That's Commander Enrico. Now, all the partisans went with an assumed name, and he chose the alias Enrico for himself. Next slide, please. There you see in the middle of this picture is my father, Comandante Enrico. He's flanked by 2 members of his command staff. And in the background is a cave. That was the cave that he had hid in. He turned that into his command headquarters. Now, he was initially put in charge of a group of 117 volunteer freedom fighters, and that detachment's role in the partisan movement was to aggressively attack enemy convoys and troops that were passing through the mountains. But they were not very effective. My father's his first job as commander was to reorganize the unit and instill discipline in his troops. And with his leadership, they started becoming effective. In the beginning, they were fighting only with single-shot rifles, but soon they found themselves fighting with captured German automatic weapons, and later with British weapons that were airdropped to them by the Allies. In this picture, my father was seen holding a British-made submachine gun. As they became more successful, more and more local Italians joined, and my father split up his now growing detachment into several different detachments, and then later on grouped together a number of detachments in the area into 4 separate brigades, each with its own commander. He himself assumed command of the 4th Brigade of the Garibaldi, with about 600 men and a few women partisan fighters. Later, the High Command ordered him to join those 4 brigades together into a single unified fighting force, a division that he was to command. And that's how my father became a division commander in the Italian Liberation Army over some 2,500 troops. Next slide, please. On April 25th, 1945, he led his troops down out of the mountains and helped with the liberation of Savona. This picture was taken a week later during a May Day celebration in the main town square. At this time, my father was working for the city of Savona as a police inspector, and he was also in charge of 200 of his former fighters who now were assisting the local police in maintaining law and order. Next slide, please. A week later, a regiment of the regular Italian army arrived, and here my father can be seen in a ceremony with that regiment's commander in which he turned the policing duties over from partisan army to regular Italian army. And with that accomplished, he tried to settle into a normal life as a police inspector in Savona. Next slide, please. Soon he began receiving awards and decorations, including the Certificate to the Patriot that was issued jointly by the British and Italian governments. The last sentence translates as, "In the reborn Italy, the bearers of this certificate will be proclaimed as heroes who fought for honor and freedom." Next slide, please. Over the next year, he was issued 4 different ID cards for different purposes. And these were the first legitimate ID cards he had carried in 6 years. Next slide, please. Then in early June of 1946, this telegram arrived at the police station in Savona. It asked the person named below, my father, to report on the 25th of June to a certain address in Milan, Italy, to receive instructions regarding the receipt of an American Declaration for Valor. The last sentence translates, "He is advised to wear his partisan uniform." Next slide, please. And there in the middle of this picture, you see my father. This picture was taken moments after a United States general pinned an American Bronze Star medal on his chest. And that event prompted him to select the United States of America to be his new home. Now, this story has not just been about one resistor who survived, but 2. Next slide, please. Leon Pergol, the man who was my father's companion and forged those ID cards. This picture was taken in Canada in the 1950s of Leon. He had been arrested, as I said, but after several weeks, he escaped from jail and walked all the way to freedom in Switzerland. He eventually got a visa to immigrate to Canada, and I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was a boy. Next slide, please. My father's story is just one example of armed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. Actually, he was just one of some 30,000 Jewish partisans, such as these you see here, who fought back in the forests of Eastern Europe. Jewish resistance has been repeated many times over the centuries. It's the key to the incredible reality of Jewish survival, because without it, our people would have disappeared centuries ago. That we are here and thriving is thanks to Herman Wygoda's times many thousands. Whenever and wherever our enemies have sought to destroy us, we always have had and always will continue to have the commitment and the courage to insist that the Jewish story must and will go on.